بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening to everybody. Thank you very much, Professor Winter. Let me tell you how pleased I am to be again in Cambridge. I spent some time in Cambridge, a few years ago, and I'm very pleased to be here in the context of this seminar organized by CMC, Cambridge Muslim College. So the purpose of this talk is to address some perspectives about science and faith. And as you know, it was mentioned by Professor Winter just a few minutes ago, according to a widespread opinion in the West, of course, the Islamic world would participate very little in the scientific pursuit of today, and it would be struck by recurrent social and political disorders. And several authors have attributed these two problems, these two facts, to the same cause: the presumed inability of Islamic religion to establish a sound relationship with the practice of reason, and consequently to enforce reasonable behaviors within societies where it predominates. In this lecture, I would like to reflect on the following issue. How does Islamic thinking see the location of reason and science in its worldview? I will address this issue from the specific viewpoint of a Western Muslim who happens to be a professional scientist. And let me start by addressing this issue of reason and science with an event that had a strong echo a few years ago. At first glance, it may seem a little bit distant from our main subject, but we shall see that, in fact, we are at the very heart of the debate. The presumed difficulty that Islam faces in its relationship with reason was summarized by the famous lecture mentioned by Professor Winter and given by Pope Benedict XVI in Regensburg on September 2006, in front of an audience of representatives of science. Of course, the detail has its importance for the issue we are addressing here. In an attempt to propose a new vision to secularized Europe, the Holy Father explained what he considered the specific feature of Christianity. For him, it is not surprising that modern science and reasonable behaviors developed in countries where Christianity was predominant, because of a link between the two meanings of the word logos, the Greek reason, and God's word in the Gospel of John. The Pope wrote, quote, "I believe that here we can see the profound harmony between what is Greek in the best sense of the word and the biblical understanding of faith in God," unquote. As a matter of fact, as you know, this lecture triggered strong reactions in the Islamic world. Not because Muslims disagreed with this view on faith and reason, but because Islam was used by the Pope as a kind of counter-example, a religion in which the absence of reason and the presence of violence are closely interwoven. According to the Pope, quote, "For Muslim teaching, God is absolutely transcendent. His will is not bound up with any of our categories, even that of rationality." Unquote. After this Regensburg lecture, there were exchanges between the Islamic world and the Holy See, requests from apologies on one side and statements that the lecture was misunderstood on the other side. Here, I would like to address the issue raised by the Holy Father very much where he left it, and to answer possibly to the calls for dialogue that were eventually heard on both sides. It seems to me that most of our ideas and behaviors are in fact conditioned by our metaphysical views on reality, even if we apparently deny any type of metaphysics. As the Pope rightly points it out, the relationship of faith and reason stems from the idea we have about God, which is the name that believers give to fundamental reality. When the Pope writes, after many other authors, quote, "For Muslim teaching, God is absolutely transcendent," unquote, he obviously understands this sentence in the following way, quote, "For Muslims, God is only transcendent, and so transcendent that his will is not bound up with any of our categories, even that of rationality," unquote. But is the God of Islam, between quotes, different from the God of Christianity? It's not the Muslim opinion, as you know. For them, for us, God is the same in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a word that etymologically means the God, is not the name of a Muslim's God that would exclude the other believers. It's the Arabic name of the one God, the God of all the humankind, worshipped by Jews, Christians, and Muslims. God is absolutely transcendent, and he is perfectly immanent too. It means that he cannot be known by any of our categories, of course, and simultaneously, he is close to us. He acts in the world. He knows us. He loves us. He lets him be known and be loved by us. As the Quran says, nothing is similar to him, and he is the one who perfectly hears and sees, unquote. The coexistence of these two aspects is necessary in a monotheistic religion to prevent our idea about God from becoming an idol. A God who is only transcendent is an abstract concept, and a God who is only immanent is nothing else than a form of cosmic energy. Of course, God is absolutely transcendent. He is so different that he can only be called Huwa, he. It is impossible to reflect on his unfathomable essence. Simultaneously, the unknowable reality unveils itself. It creates the world. It speaks in the history of humankind. It inspires the faithful and the righteous. Why is it so? There is no other answer than Rahmah, mercy. Your Lord has written for himself mercy, the Quran says. Kataballahu ala nafsihi rahmah. This love of mercy, this rahmah, is, according to a prophetic tradition, the origin of a love that mothers of all living species have for their children, since etymology evocates maternal womb, arahim. From his rahmah, God, according to his name Ar-Rahman, the compassionate, creates the world, and according to his name Ar-Rahim, the all-merciful, he has a specific relationship with each of his creatures. Because of his mercy, God chooses to make himself be known, or to be more accurate, he chooses to make his qualities, attributes, and actions be known by us. As a matter of fact, God's immanence is possible because God is so transcendent that his transcendence is unaffected by his presence in the world, close to us. However, the raison d'être of the world is a mystery, because it is not rooted in the necessity that God would have to be known, but in God's free desire to be known. One can readily see that the issue of intelligibility, the issue of the intelligibility of God's qualities, attributes, and actions, and the extension of a domain in which reason can apply to understand religion and to practice the scientific inquiry in the world, strongly depends on the balance between transcendence and immanence. It is true that extreme standpoints existed and still exist in the Islamic thinking, in one direction, transcendence, or the other, immanence. However, the mainstream simultaneously defends the fundamental mystery of God's essence and the intelligibility of God's qualities and actions rooted into their similarity with the world's qualities and actions. The mode of this intelligibility primarily comes from the specific pattern of the Holy Book of Islam, that is, the Holy Quran. We could say that the miracle of the descent of the Quran reproduces the miracle of creation. God creates things through his speech, with his order, be, kun. The creatures receive their existence from God through his order. God subsequently unveils hidden knowledge, again through his speech, by another of his orders, read, Iqra, the first word of the Quran given to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This instruction speaks to the reader, the human being who uses its intelligence to understand the holy text. As a consequence, the Quran is like a second creation, a book where God shows his signs or verses, ayat, in the same way as we contemplate God's signs, ayat, in the entities and phenomena of the first creation. God unveiled the book of existence very much as he unveiled the book of religion. The issue of a relationship of faith with science specifically deals with the coherence between the first and the second book, the book of existence and the book of revelation. And this topic of liber scripturae and liber mundi in Latin is expressed in similar terms in other faiths. According to the constant teaching of Islamic tradition and because of the specific status of the holy text of Islam as the fundamental axis of revelation, faith is intimately linked to knowledge. A famous Quranic verse prescribes, "Worship your Lord till certainty." And many prophetic sayings strongly recommend the pursuit of knowledge as a religious duty incumbent to all Muslims. All kinds of knowledge that can be in some way connected to God and that help the religious and mundane life of society are good and have to be pursued. Clearly, when the Prophet ﷺ recommended that his companions search for knowledge as far as China, he did not allude primarily to religious knowledge. Thus, knowledge can be religious, but it can also be rational and or spiritual. In any case, the revelation does not include all aspects of knowledge. For instance, there is a well-known story about the independence of natural rules with respect to religious teaching. Farmers in Medina, who used to grow date palms, asked the Prophet whether it was necessary to graft these date palms. And the Prophet answered no, and they followed his advice. They then complained that the date crops were very bad. The Prophet answered that he was only a human being, like them. He said, quote, "You are more knowledgeable than I in the best interests of this world of yours," unquote. This is a very important story. Clearly there is a domain in which religion simply has nothing to say, a domain which is neutral with respect to the ritual and legal teachings of revelation. However, it does not mean that searching for this type of knowledge is neutral from a spiritual point of view. Because Islam does not separate the intellectual aspects of life from ethical concerns, the only knowledge that should be avoided is useless knowledge that closes our eyes to the treasures of our own spiritual vocation. To summarize, the descent of the Quran, in which God veils and unveils his transcendence and his immanence, provides the Muslims with a way to celebrate God's mystery, as well as to approach his intelligibility. This intelligibility requires the use of reason encapsulated in a broader perspective of knowledge. Through his explanations and promises, God chooses to be partly bound by the categories of reason, out of his mercy and love for the world. But reason itself is unable to approach all the truth, because truth is not only conceptual, it also involves all the being. In the Islamic perspective, the intellect precisely includes the practice of reason and the lucidity to understand where reason ceases to be efficient in this quest. The question of the exact extension of the domain of reason has been debated, and I will now try to illustrate the type of debates that took place in Islamic thinking about this issue. After the extension of the Islamic Empire during the Umayyad and Abbasid Caliphates, Islamic thinking met Greek science and philosophy. At that time, it became necessary to define the place of rational knowledge in the religious pursuit more accurately by marking the field that we can validly explore with our own reason. The great thinker Al-Ghazali, known in the West as Al-Ghazal, examined the relation between science and philosophy on the one hand, religion on the other. As all his predecessors, he had the strong belief that there is only one truth, and that well-guided reason cannot be in contradiction with textual indications given by the Quran. However, Al-Ghazali writes, there is a, quote, double risk, unquote, in the practice of sciences. On the one hand, because scientists may be too proud with themselves, they often adventure beyond the field where reason can validly apply, and they make metaphysical or theological statements about God or religious issues that happen to contradict textual indications. On the other hand, the common believers, after seeing the excesses of these scientists, are led to reject all sciences indiscriminately. Al-Ghazali condemned, quote, those who believe they defend Islam by rejecting the philosophical sciences, unquote, and, quote, actually cause much damage to it, unquote. Now, providing there is only one truth, how to deal with possible contradictions between science and Quranic verses? For Al-Ghazali, the situation is clear. Wherever science apparently contradicts textual indications given by the Quran or the Sunnah, it is the fault of the scientists who surely have made errors in their scientific works as far as they have been led to conclusions which are at odds with revealed truth. Almost 1 century later, Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, examines again the issue addressed by Al-Ghazali. As you know, Ibn Rushd was a judge, qadi, and his text is indeed a juridical pronouncement, fatwa, to establish, quote, whether the study of philosophy and logic is allowed by the revealed law or condemned by it or prescribed, either as recommended or as mandatory, end quote. For Ibn Rushd, the conclusion is clear. The study of philosophy and logic is mandatory, as a duty for all society. Now, he writes, quote, since the Quran is true and prompts to practicing rational examination, which leads to the knowledge of truth, we Muslims know with certainty that rational examination will never contradict the teachings of a revealed text, because truth cannot contradict truth, but agrees with it and supports it, unquote. As a consequence, Ibn Rushd explains that wherever the results of rational examination contradict the textual indications given by the Quran, its contradiction is only apparent, and the text, the religious text, has to be submitted to allegorical interpretation, what he calls ta'wil, in order to make the things consistent. Otherwise, he says, we would make God say things which are obviously wrong. For Al-Ghazali, as well as for Ibn Rushd, reason is God's gift to the human being, and God warrants its efficiency. For them, there is only one truth, and it is not possible to state that from the religious viewpoint one believes in something, and from the rational viewpoint one believes in the contrary. But they differ. They differ on which of the 2 points of view has to get the predominance. Of course, Ibn Rushd has a standpoint that sounds quite modern, interpretation of the texts. But let us remember Al-Ghazali too, and his criticisms of the excesses of the scientists who extrapolate theories beyond their domain of validity and claim that they have a final word on the nature of reality. In any case, science widely developed during a golden period that has lasted for several centuries. Scientists in the Islamic world, mostly Muslims, but also Jews and Christians and even Sabites, recovered Greek science and enlarged and deepened it. Many names could be hereafter recalled. Let me mention a few ones who lived in a time span from the 9th to the 14th centuries. Al-Khwarizmi, the founder of algorithmics and algebra, Thabit ibn Qurra and his works on amical numbers, Abd al-Rahman al-Sufi, who made a census of stars and gave them their names, names which are still in use today in the book of fixed stars. Ibn al-Haytham, the founder of optics and the inventor of a camera obscura. Ibn Sina, who wrote medical handbooks who have been in use in the East and West for centuries. Al-Biruni, an astronomer and mathematician, Ibn Battuta, a geographer and traveler, or Ibn Khaldun, considered as the founder of social sciences and the precursor of history of civilizations. You see here a few examples for astronomy. The Muslim scientists not only translated the Al-Majest, the main book of the Middle Ages in astronomy, but they corrected the errors that were present in the book, and more specifically the numerical errors. It's now increasingly clear that the Copernican revolution would not have occurred without the works of mathematicians and astronomers such as Al-Tusi, Al-Urdi, and Ibn Shatir, who lived in the 13th and 14th century. 1 century later, Ali Khushri criticized Aristotelian philosophy and physics in the context of skepticism of Islamic theology with respect to Aristotelian causality. He advocated a complete separation of astronomy on the one hand and philosophy on the other, and he argued about the possibility of Earth rotation. Of course, one could ask why a student of Ali Khushri did not go one step further and propose a heliocentric model comparable to the Copernican one. Why didn't modern science develop in the Islamic world? This is part of what Joseph Needham called the grand question. It's a widely debated issue, but it is a fact that the center of Islamic activity eventually moved to the West. Now, the Islamic world has a great interest for science, but a lot of disagreement about what science is or has to be fully incorporated into Islamic societies by being made Islamic. Well, basically 3 streams in the debate. For the modernist stream, Islamic science is only universal science practiced by scientists who happen to be Muslims. For the reconstruction stream, Islamic science has to be rebuilt from Islamic principles in the prospect of the needs of Islamic societies. For the traditional stream, Islamic science is the ancient, symbolic science that has to be recovered in a prospect that is more respectful of nature and of the spiritual pursuit of the scientists. These 3 streams of contemporary Islamic thinking show an intense activity on the relationship between science and religion. All of them have to identify pitfalls on their path. The main issue is that these 3 conceptions are conceptions that are elaborated a priori as mental representations of the activity of Muslim scientists, and they may have little to do with the actual practice of science in laboratories. If I were to comment on these streams, I would say that, in some sense, each of them seizes and emphasizes a part of the situation. Yes, it is true that science and its methods and philosophy is largely universal and the common property of humankind. Yes, it is true that science cannot be decoupled from the society in which it develops, and that the way it is organized, the topics that are highlighted, the ethic that is practiced, are influenced by the worldview of the scientists. Yes, it is true that even if science describes the material cosmos with great success, the issue of meaning and purpose and the inclusion of the scientific pursuit in a broader quest for knowledge have to be considered by scientists who are believers. As a matter of fact, there is also the fashionable trend of the so-called scientific insuperability of the Quran, Ijaz ilmi. This stream tries to extract scientific statements from the Quran. My feeling is that, of course, since Muslims consider that the holy text is a miracle, nothing can be excluded a priori. But I have some concern about the emphasis which is put in the tafsir, in the interpretation of the Quran at this level, because it seems to me that in some sense it blinds our eyes to another niyyah, another kind of interpretation which is more spiritual. And most of the debate on this issue often forget a fundamental starting point, that is the nature of the knowledge which is brought forth by the Quranic revelation. As it is explained already in the first verses that are revealed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, God speaks to the human being to teach him what he does not know. اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم. He taught the human that which he knew not about the afterlife, about the other world, about salvation. The teachings of the Quran consist in highlighting the spiritual vocation of a human being, the purpose of creation, and the mysteries of the hereafter. They speak mostly of what to do to act righteously and to hope to be saved. And the teachings of Revelation are proposed under the veils of allegories, myths, and symbols. The Hadith mentioned the multiplicity of the meanings of the Quran by saying that, quote, each verse has an outer meaning and an inner meaning, a juridical meaning and a locus for ascension, for spiritual ascension. That is, a direct spiritual influence on the reader. We have to accept these allegorical interpretations because science has provided us with more knowledge about the world. And the allegorical interpretations help us purify our ideas about the way God acts in creation. But myths and symbols in the holy texts are not only allegories. The language of the mythos, the language of the symbols, conveys meanings that cannot be expressed otherwise. That is in the language of the logos, the language of articulated and clear reason, clear language. Myths, symbols, are just like fingers that point to realities that would otherwise be beyond our attention, beyond our grasp. They just call for the meaning they allude to knowledge that is obtained by an intuition in relationship and resonance with the contemplation of the symbols. In some sense, all ritual actions are symbols. Symbols that bring spiritual influence. The myths and symbols work within us. They raise us over our limited understanding. They open us to a level of intelligibility that goes beyond the practice of rational, of algorithmic thinking. With this view, it is possible to avoid a literalistic reading of a text and to focus on spiritual reality. Let me now propose a view on how the articulation between modern science and religion can be addressed in the Islamic tradition. I would like to suggest that the theological and metaphysical corpus of Islamic thinking is rich enough to help a Muslim scientist find a meaning in the world as it is described by the current scientific inquiry. I will only give 4 examples on how this convergence can take place. First of all, the issue of the intelligibility of the world. This is a mystery for science. There is a fundamental mystery. The fundamental mystery of the intelligibility of the world. For the Islamic tradition, this intelligibility is part of the divine plans for the world, since God, who knows everything, created both the world and the human being from his intelligence. Then he put his intelligence in the human. By looking at the cosmos, our intelligence constantly meets God's intelligence put in the cosmos. And the fact that God is one warrants the unity of the human and the cosmos, and the adequacy of our intelligence to understanding at least part of the world. The sense of awe that comes from the contemplation of the world comes from its beauty and majesty, that reflects that God's beauty and majesty. Second, God's action in creation. How does God act in his creation? According to mainstream Islamic theology, God does not act by fixing the laws of physics and the initial conditions and letting the world evolve mechanistically. God, as the primary cause, does not cease to create the world again and again. In this continuous renewal of creation, tajdid al-khalq, the atoms and the accidents are created anew at each time. The regularities that are observed in the world are not due to causal connection, but to a constant conjunction between the phenomena, which is a habit or custom established by God's will. The Quran says you will not find change in God's custom, and there is no change in God's creation. Clearly, this does not mean that creation is immutable, since in many verses the Quran emphasizes the changes that we see in the sky and on earth. These verses mean that there is a stability in the rules of creation that reflects God's immutability. And the scientist has to study this stability in the rules of creation. Moreover, these regularities that are a consequence of God's will can be qualified as mathematical regularities. Several verses draw the reader's attention to the numerical order that is present in the cosmos. For instance, الشمس والقمر بحسبان. The sun and the moon are ordered according to an exact computation. In any case, the metaphysical criticism of causality by Islam did not hamper the development of Islamic science at the same epoch. On the contrary, the criticism of the Aristotelian conception of the causes as mere conditions for effects to occur necessarily and immediately opened the way to a deeper examination of the world to describe what the habit or custom, sunnah, proposed by God actually was. Deductive thinking that goes from causes to effects cannot be used a priori in the realm of nature. One has to actually observe what is actually happening as the consequence of God's will. The development of science in Islam during the great classical period was closely linked to the will to look at phenomena, that is, to look at God's sunnah in the world, at God's habit or custom in the world. I like this image because you see, this is a pillar of the mosque, and you see God's names everywhere. This is a representation, an artistic representation of what I was saying. God as the first cause present at each point of reality. Third, God praises and loves diversity. This is a marvelous saying of the mosque about this story of diversity. One fundamental element of Islamic doctrine is the fact that God praises and loves diversity. For instance, I can cite a Quranic verse, quote, "Among his signs, the creation of the heavens and the earth and the diversity of your languages and your colors," unquote. As a matter of fact, God never ceases to create because of his love. This divine love reaches the diversity of creatures, physical phenomena, plants and animals, as well as the human diversity of ethnical types, languages and cultures, and extends to the diversity of religions, according to the well-known verse, وَلَوْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ لَجَعَلَكُمْ أُمَّةً وَاحِدَةً. And if God had wanted, he could surely have made you all one single community. A Muslim scientist can easily appreciate this love of diversity in the meditation on the results of modern science. Thanks to the technical means of exploration, modern cosmology has discovered a spectacular view on the universe of galaxies. This is an image which has been taken by the Hubble Space Telescope. In a small area of the sky, only 11 square arc minutes and 10,000 galaxies are observed here. Basically, all the spots that you see in this image are galaxies. And if we compute how many galaxies are potentially observable with these means, we find 100 billion galaxies. And each galaxy, each spot that you see on the image, consists in typically 100 billion stars. That makes 10,000 billion stars in the observable universe. And it is very likely that each of these stars is surrounded by several planets. It makes an incredible number of planets, to which one must connect the fact that differential evolution of the planets gives each planet a specific identity that does not look like the others. These are examples of exoplanets which are found around nearby stars. The star has been masked, it's very bright, and the planets which are orbiting the stars are very small and they are not very visible. So there are sophisticated techniques to mask the star at the center of each of these images. And you see the small dots here. It's something which is orbiting around the star. It's a planet. around formaldehyde, the mouth of the fish, the name which has been given by Abdurrahman al-Sufi. Here you see another star. This one there is a doubt about the possibility that it is an actual object, but there's no doubt about this one. So there are many objects. It's now believed that there are planets, maybe 10 planets around each star. And since there are 10,000 billion stars in the observable universe, that makes a large number of stars. Of course, we do not know how much of these planets actually harbor life. But astrophysicists cannot contemplate these large numbers without thinking that life probably exists elsewhere in the universe, maybe everywhere in the universe. Only on Earth there are millions of living species. Can one imagine what the observable universe is? And the patch of the universe that we can probe with our telescopes is only a small bubble in a much larger universe by a factor of many billions. And this patch of the universe, much larger than the observable universe, may be encapsulated in an infinite multiverse in which the laws of physics and the properties of the outcomes greatly vary from patch to patch. What is the meaning of that all? What is the meaning of that all? A believer can read the creativity and love of God in this landscape. This is an image of the diversity in the universe, so all these forms of galaxies, stars, nebulae, planets, and so on. This image is one of the most popular images published in the world. It has been taken on the eve of Christmas 1968 by the astronauts of one of the Apollo missions en route to the moon. They did not land on the moon, but they were the first human being to contemplate the Earth as a single body and to get the feeling of unity of humankind on this fragile ship in the darkness of space. This was called the blue-orange. We see how fragile the Earth is with its oceans, its clouds, its atmosphere, which is only a thin layer, 10 kilometers. And this is an image which has had a strong impact. Later on, an automated probe called Voyager was launched to survey Jupiter and Saturn, and on its way to these planets, it took this picture, and for the first time we see the moon and the Earth on the same image. The full moon and the full Earth on the same image. And a few years later, beyond the orbit of Saturn, Voyager took a picture of the Earth seen at that distance. There is in panel here show an enlargement, and you see that the Earth, the dot, is not completely circular because there is something like an extension on the right. That's the moon. That's the moon, which is behind the Earth, and which is seen very almost almost invisible. And this other image is very famous too. It's called the pale blue dots. I'm sorry, that's something in French which is left. The Earth seen by Voyager 1 in 1990 from a distance of 6 billion kilometers. 6 billion kilometers. It seems a lot for us, but I remind you that the nearest star is at 10,000 billion kilometers from us. So and you see the small dot here. If you don't see it, as an enlargement. That's the Earth. That's the Earth seen at some distance, lost in space, with all these stars and planets and so on. And that makes us reflect about the destiny of humankind on Earth and about the necessity of ethics to preserve the gift granted by God to humanity, to the humankind. As you know, according to the Islamic doctrine, the human being is created from clay and from God's Spirit to become Khalifatullah fil ard, God's vice-regent on earth. And the human being is the only creature that is able to know God through all his names and attributes, and it is put on earth as a garden keeper in the garden. And our relationship with other living creatures on earth is not that from the upper to the lower level, with a concomitant possibility to exploit all inferior beings. It is a relationship from the central to the peripheral. The central position of a garden keeper on earth is the position of a watchman who equally cares after all the inhabitants of a garden. It implies a sense of accountability for all creation, and it should lead to humility, not to arrogance. As a consequence, we can eat the fruits of a garden, but we have no right to uproot the trees, which do not belong to us. The power that science has given to us must be accompanied by a greater sense of the ethic that is necessary to use this power with discrimination and intelligence. To say the things in a few words, we must not do all what we can do, very much as Adam was not allowed to touch one specific tree in the garden. This prohibition makes us free, because freedom requires the possibility of a choice. The symbol of a garden keeper in the garden has a strong echo today with the current debates on how to deal with global warming, the share of natural resources in a sustainable way, or the preservation of biodiversity. As you know, humankind is facing a dramatic challenge in this 21st century. How can different cultures live peacefully on our fragile planet and use its limited resources without spoiling it? What has the debate between science and religion to do with that? To my eyes, it is relevant for at least two reasons. First, we shall have to change our everyday habits in the future, inshallah. And we shall have to take difficult decisions about the way we exploit nature. And in this prospect, a reconnection of knowledge with ethics is unavoidable. Second, each religion and culture will have to determine its relation with the other ones. And I think that the idea that God wrote two books, the book of creation and the book of scriptures, and that these books are in fundamental agreement in spite of apparent discrepancies, can in some way prepare us to the idea that God has written or revealed many books of scriptures that are also in fundamental agreement in spite of apparent discrepancies. In conclusion, let me address this issue of ultimate truth and tell you a brief story that illustrates the mystery of the human condition. We have to go back to the past and look again at Ibn Rushd Averroes. Around 1180, Ibn Rushd was informed that a young man called Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, aged about 15, was granted spiritual openings during his retreats. Ibn Rushd, who was the greater philosopher of his time, invited this youngster to meet with him. Later, Ibn Arabi, who then was considered as the great master of Islamic mysticism, wrote about the story of a meeting in the introduction of his major book, The Meccan Openings, Futuhat al-Makkiyah, a big treatise that unveils the content of his spiritual intuitions. And I just follow the tale written by Ibn Arabi. When I entered in upon Ibn Rushd, he stood up out of love and respect. He embraced me and said, "Yes." I said, "Yes." His joy increased because I had understood him. Then I realized why he had rejoiced at that. So I said, "No." His joy disappeared and his colors changed, and he adopted what he possessed in himself. It's a very strange exchange because there are only answers and there are no questions. And the questions come after the answers. Ibn Rushd said, "How did you find the situation in unveiling and divine effusion? Is it what rational consideration gives to us?" And Ibn Arabi replied, "Yes, no, na'am la." Between the yes and the no, spirits fly from their matter and heads from their bodies. Ibn Arabi reports on Ibn Rushd's reaction to these words, quote, "His color turned pale and he began to tremble. He started reciting, La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, there is no power and no strength but in God. He has understood my allusion," unquote. To my eyes, this story is very profound. isn't it surprising that the first answer to Ibn Rushd's question, how did you find the situation in unveiling and divine diffusion? Is it what rational consideration gives to us? Isn't it surprising that the first answer is Na'am, yes. Reason can go very far to capture reality. However, we should not rejoice too much, because reason cannot explain out the fundamental mystery of our lives. We must live with the Na'am, La, the yes, no, without even an and between the yes and the no to make the articulation softer. We must live with this tension of the mystery of reality. As a matter of fact, Ibn Arabi alluded to eschatology by recalling that no one has been intimately changed by scientific knowledge or rational knowledge. Knowing mathematics, Gödel's theorem, quantum physics, the standard hot Big Bang model, and so forth, changes our worldview and maybe the way our minds work, but it does not change our arts. Of course, these discoveries are fundamental milestones in intellectual history. They can produce strong feelings in those who dedicate their lives to such studies. But revelation speaks of another degree or intensity of truth, a degree that changes our very being, but by making us better and by preparing us for the mystery of the afterlife. The teaching of religions is that we shall have to leave this world and enter another level of being to pursue the quest of knowledge in a broader locus more fitted to contemplating God than our narrow physical world. Of course, our reason fails to conceive how such a thing is possible. It's not a matter of reason, it's a matter of faith in the promises of our holy scriptures. At that time, I think it's better to stop speaking, because as the poet and mystic Jalaluddin Rumi says, the pen, when it reaches this point, just breaks. And this is my last word.